When I execute this code, the compiler is going to execute only the first catch block and it's going to ignore rest of the catch block. During the execution of finally block, it's not going to bother about even the exception is handled or not. The compiler is going to generate some error that is out of memory exception. Hello to all, a warm welcome to my new session on managing errors and exception. I'm your Revati ma'am, faculty from the Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, First Grade College, Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. So dear student, today also we are going to discuss about how to handle the exception and what are the technique we are going to have under this programming language. Before that, let me to recall the topic what I have discussed in my previous session. So dear student, in my previous session, I started with what is an error. Along with that, I have discussed three types of errors, that is logical error, syntax error and runtime error. Along with that, I have discussed C# exception handling. So here, exception handling is a mechanism used to handle different kinds of errors, especially runtime errors. Along with that, I have discussed different kinds of classes which is provided by the exception class. Along with that, I have discussed try and catch as well as some exception handler mechanism and some example programs. So dear student, from the examination point of view, this concept is very important and even you can expect one sure question under this topic, that is one 2-mark question and one long question, that is for 7 or 8 marks. Now, once again in my today's session, I'm going to discuss remaining topic under this unit, that is multiple catch block in C#. That means how I can able to write multiple catch block in order to handle the exception and what is the use of finally keyword and some exception hierarchy. Anyway, dear student, let's see why I want multiple catch block and how I can able to implement multiple catch block. So dear student, it is possible to write multiple catch block for single try. So dear student, I have try, okay, and whatever the code I want to execute and that generates an error that is written inside the try block. Now, when this code generates an error, that can be handled by the catch block. Okay, now for this single try, I can able to have multiple catch block. Even though we are going to write multiple catch block, but in C#, it's going to handle only the proper catch block and it's going to execute only the proper catch block and it's going to ignore rest of the catch block. So it is possible in C# to write multiple catch block for a given try block. In the sense, I can able to write multiple catch block for single try block. When we implement multiple catch block in C#, then at any given point of time, only one catch block is going to execute and further catch blocks are ignored. In the sense, see here, I have the try block, okay, and I'm trying to divide some number by 0. For that, I will write two catch block. Okay, one is going to handle divide by 0 exception, and another one is I'm going to have array index out of bound exception. Okay, and when I execute this code, the compiler is going to execute only the first catch block and it's going to ignore rest of the catch block. So here, when I have multiple catch block for single try, then what's going to happen? It's going to execute only the corresponding catch block and it's going to ignore rest of the catch block. So dear student, by keeping this ideology, let me to write simple code. So dear student, this is the example program for multiple catch block, and as I discussed, see here, I have the try block, and for this single try block, I have two catch block. Now, let me to explain this program in detail. So, dear student, my program is going to start from using system and I'm going to create the namespace. And what is my namespace here? That is nothing but exception handling demo. Inside this, I'm going to create the class called program, and inside the program, I have the main method. Now see here, I'm going to give some message to the user that enter any two number. So what I want to do? I want to enter some number. So this is the message to the user. Now see here what I'm going to do. Whatever the lines I have to read the input, I'm going to place within the try block and I'm going to perform the division. So dear students, see here, console is a class that supports read line method, and this method is used to read the input from the user, and from where I'm going to get the input from the keyboard. Now why it is parse int? Because whatever the input I'm going to read from the keyboard, that is in the form of string. Now I want to convert that string into integer. So I'm going to convert string into integer. Now I have A and B. Okay, now I'm going to divide A divided by B. Now see here, console dot write line, and I'm trying to print the output. Now let me to take some example here. Think that A is 10 and my B value is 0. Okay, when I perform 10 by 0, what's going to happen? This code is going to generate some exception, and that is handled by this catch block. Okay, so what kind of exception? That is divide by 0 exception. And I'm going to display the message in the sense second number should not be 0. Suppose if I want to perform division, then I must have some number. Okay, so here what message I'm going to display? That is second number should not be 0. And the compiler is going to ignore this line because in C hash I can able to write multiple catch block. But while executing the program, the compiler is going to consider only one block at a time and it's going to ignore rest of the catch block. Now, dear student, I'm going to have the finally. So, dear student, this is also exception handling technique, and in this, I'm going to perform all the cleanup procedures as well as I'm going to close the connection. So what is cleanup procedure? There are certain times some resources are assigned to the process, And now I just want to deallocate the resources. For that, I'm going to have the finally. And there are certain time I'm going to allocate some memory. And I want to deallocate that memory. And where I'm going to do all these things in my finally. And once again, if I consider database connection, in my program, I'm going to connect the database. Now, I just want to disconnect the database connection. For that, once again, I'm going to use finally. So here, C hash finally block is to execute important code which is to be executed whether exception is handled or not. That means whatever the code I'm going to write inside the finally block, that must be executed in C hash programming, even though exception is handled or it is not handled. And it's not going to bother about the exception handling, but it's going to execute the code what I'm going to place inside the finally. And what is the need of finally? It's mainly used to close all the connections. It's mainly used to perform cleanup procedure, etc. Now, I have simple code to illustrate the use of finally. And the program starts from using system, and my class name here is ex example, and I have the main method. Inside that, see, I have the try block, and I have A equal to 10, B equal to 0, and I'm trying to divide 10 by 0. Now what's going to happen? This code is going to generate some exception, and this is handled by the catch block. Okay, fine. See here in my catch block, console dot write line. So what is my exception class here? That is exception, and here E is nothing but the object. Now I have the finally block. Inside that console dot write line, finally block is executed, and okay, I'm going to have the rest of the code. Now, when I compile this program, what output I'm going to get? That is, this exception is handled properly. So, I'm going to get system dot divide by 0 exception. Okay, see here. What is the exception? I'm trying to divide the number by 0, and this code throws some exception that is catched by this catch block, and I'm going to get the output system dot divide by 0 exception, and I'm going to get the message that attempted to divide by 0. Okay, now I'm going to get the output, that is finally block output, that is finally block is executed, and I'm going to get the last output, that is rest of the code. So dear student, during the execution of finally block, it's not going to bother about even the exception is handled or not. But what's the job of the finally block is to execute finally block. That's it. Now, I'm going to have another topic, that is the exception hierarchy. So dear student, till now we were discussing about what is exception, what are the different kinds of keywords we have to handle the exception, etc. But now I'm going to discuss the exception hierarchy. So dear student, the exception is categorized into two type of exception, that is system exception and application exception. So what is system exception? While writing the program, whatever the exception I'm going to get, that is known as system application. And what about application exception? So dear student, during the designing of an application, and if we get any error or any exception while designing the application, that is known as application exception. And the system exception includes array index out of range exception. So what is array index out of range exception? To illustrate this concept, let me to take simple example. Think that I have the array size 5. Okay, I have the array size 5 and in my program, I'm trying to access 10th element. Okay, and when I write a of 5, it starts from 0 to 4. So what is the range of array A? That is 0 to 4. But here I'm trying to access the 9th element. Then what's going to happen? I'm going to get the error message that I allocated only 0 to 4, but I'm trying to get 9th position element. So it is array index, that is index out of range exception. So here I'm requesting 9th index, but it is not in my array. I requested only 0 to 4, but still I'm trying to access 9th index. So I'm going to get the error index out of range exception. And another kind of exception, that is null reference exception. So dear student, I'm trying to create object. After the creation of the object, I'm trying to assign some null object. That means I'm going to refer some null object. In that time, what is going to happen? That is, it generates some error that is known as null reference exception. After that, I'm going to have the invalid cast exception. So dear student, there are certain time I'm trying to perform typecasting, and if I try some invalid typecasting, then what's going to happen? I'm just getting the error message. For example, think that I have the int. Okay, now I'm trying to convert this integer to string. Okay, and whatever the method I'm going to use to convert integer to string, which is not supported by the C# programming, and that time you're going to get the message that invalid cast exception. After that, I'm going to have the out of memory exception. So out of memory in the sense what? Think that you have some amount of memory in your computer system. Now you're going to request more than the capacity of your computer system. That means you're going to request the memory which is not in your computer system. So what's going to happen? You're going to get the error message. For example, think that in your computer system you have only 10 byte of memory. Okay, you have only 10 byte of memory, but your program wants 20 byte of memory. Now, what is going to happen? The compiler is going to generate some error, that is out of memory exception. So whatever the memory we are requesting, that is not present in our computer system. So what's going to happen? The compiler is going to throw some error. And what kind of error? That is out of memory exception. After that, I'm going to have argument error. So whatever the parameters I'm going to pass in my method, if that is not going to match with the method call, then what's going to happen? That is nothing but the argument exception. Now, this argument exception, there are two type of argument, that is argument null exception and argument out of range exception. So dear student, if I consider argument null exception, that means whatever the argument I have, for that I'm having some null value, and that time what the compiler will do, it's going to generate some kind of error that is known as argument null exception. And I have argument out of range exception. So dear student, while passing arguments, what you're going to do, you're going to pass the argument which is not in our range. So what's going to happen? That is argument out of range exception. After that, if I consider arithmetic exception in the sense what? While performing any arithmetic operation, if we get any errors or any exception, then it falls under arithmetic exception. And what are the arithmetic exception we can have here? That is divide by 0 and overflow exception. So what is divide by 0 exception? That is, while dividing any given number, if I try to divide the number by 0, then compiler throws some error, and that is known as divide by 0 exception and overflow exception. So dear student, when I divide any number by 0, I'm going to get some exception. And who is going to throw the exception? That is none other than try block is going to throw some exception, that is handled by the catch block. And what kind of exception? That is nothing but the divide by 0 exception. So these are the sum of the exception hierarchy, and these are the commonly occurred and occurring exception in our C# programming language. Anyway, dear student, in my today's session, I started with what is finally. Along with that, I have discussed how to write and how to handle multiple catch block. Along with that, I have discussed exception class hierarchy. Anyway, dear student, in my next session, I am going to deal with nested try block. In that, once again, I am going to deal with throwing our own exception in C#. Along with that, I'm going to deal with checked and unchecked and what are the need of checked and unchecked. Anyway, dear student, let's meet in the next session with the new concept, that is nested try block, along with that checked and unchecked. Until that, keep watching and keep learning and keep smiling. Thank you.